On the northern coast of Africa, where the land of modern Tunisia reaches out toward the island of Sicily, there once stood a city that commanded the western Mediterranean for over 600 years. Its harbors held fleets of warships that no other power could match. Its merchants traded in every port from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the shores of the Black Sea. Its wealth was legendary, its walls virtually impregnable, and its influence stretched across 3 continents. This was Carthage, the city the Romans called their greatest enemy, the only civilization that came close to destroying Rome itself. And yet today, almost nothing of it remains above ground. The Romans saw to that. They dismantled it so thoroughly that for centuries scholars debated whether it had ever truly been as great as the ancient sources claimed. But archaeology has confirmed what the texts always said. Carthage was one of the most remarkable cities the ancient world ever produced. The story of Carthage begins with the Phoenicians, a seafaring people who inhabited the narrow coastal strip of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians were not empire builders in the traditional sense. They did not conquer vast territories or field enormous armies. Instead, they built something arguably more enduring, a commercial network that connected the entire Mediterranean basin. From their home cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, Phoenician merchants sailed west, establishing trading posts and colonies along the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. They traded in purple dye extracted from Murex sea snails, a commodity so valuable that their very name, Phoenician, likely derives from the Greek word for purple. They traded in cedarwood from the mountains of Lebanon, in glass, in metalwork, in textiles, and in the tin and silver they obtained from mines at the far western edge of the known world. According to tradition, Carthage was founded in 814 BC by settlers from the city of Tyre, led by a woman named Elissa, whom the Romans later called Dido. The legend tells that Elissa fled Tyre after her brother, King Pygmalion, murdered her wealthy husband to seize his fortune. She gathered a group of loyal followers, loaded ships with treasure, and sailed west to find a new home. When she landed on the coast of North Africa, she negotiated with the local Berber inhabitants for a piece of land no larger than could be covered by an ox hide. But Elissa was clever. She cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips and laid them end to end, enclosing a large hilltop that would become the Bursa, the citadel of Carthage. Whether or not this legend contains historical truth, it captures something essential about the Carthaginian character, resourcefulness, commercial instinct, and a willingness to use intelligence where others might use force. The name Carthage itself, Carthage in the Phoenician language, means simply new city. But within a few centuries of its founding, it had far surpassed the mother city of Tyre in wealth and power. Its location was superb. Situated on a peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, it possessed 2 natural harbors, one commercial and one military, and commanded the narrow strait between Africa and Sicily through which all east-west Mediterranean shipping had to pass. Any vessel sailing between the eastern and western Mediterranean essentially passed under Carthaginian eyes. This geographic advantage formed the foundation of Carthaginian power for over half a millennium. By the 6th century BC, Carthage had become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. It controlled the North African coast from modern Libya to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. It held colonies in western Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and southern Spain. Its merchants had exclusive trading relationships with peoples as far away as the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain and the gold-producing regions of West Africa. The Greek geographer Strabo recorded that Carthaginian ships sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, and ventured into the open Atlantic. One Carthaginian explorer, Hanno the Navigator, is said to have sailed down the west coast of Africa sometime around 500 BC, possibly reaching as far as modern Cameroon or Gabon. If these accounts are accurate, the Carthaginians explored the African coast nearly 2,000 years before the Portuguese. The city itself grew into one of the largest and wealthiest in the ancient world. At its peak in the 3rd century BC, Carthage may have housed between 300,000 and 400,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in size to Rome, Alexandria, and the great cities of the Hellenistic East. The city was famous for its massive defensive walls, which extended for over 34 kilometers around the urban area and rose to a height of 13 meters in places. The walls were so thick that they contained stables for elephants and horses, barracks for soldiers, and storage for weapons and supplies. Ancient writers described them as virtually impregnable, and indeed Carthage was never taken by direct assault until its final destruction in 146 BC. The harbors of Carthage were an engineering marvel that impressed all who saw them. The commercial harbor, called the Kothun, was a large rectangular basin connected to the sea by a narrow channel. Ships could enter, load and unload cargo, and depart in an orderly fashion. Behind the commercial harbor lay the military harbor, a circular basin approximately 325 meters in diameter, surrounded by covered docks that could shelter 220 warships simultaneously. At the center of the military harbor stood an island from which the admiral could observe and direct the entire fleet. The whole complex could be sealed off from the sea by heavy chains across the entrance channel, making it impervious to surprise attack. Nothing quite like it existed anywhere else in the ancient world. Carthaginian society was organized around commerce. Unlike Rome, which glorified military service and political office, Carthage elevated the merchant, the shipbuilder, and the trader. The ruling class was a commercial aristocracy, families who had grown wealthy through trade and maintained their position through continued economic success. The government was a mixed system combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. 2 elected magistrates called Sophetes served as heads of state, similar in some ways to the Roman consuls. A council of elders, drawn from the wealthy families, controlled much of the day-to-day governance. And a popular assembly of citizens had the power to decide matters on which the Sophetes and the council disagreed. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, praised the Carthaginian constitution as one of the best designed systems of government in the world, noting that it had maintained internal stability for centuries without degenerating into tyranny or falling into civil war. The Carthaginians were also remarkable engineers and agriculturalists. A Carthaginian writer named Mago produced a treatise on agriculture in 28 volumes that was so highly regarded that the Roman Senate ordered it translated into Latin after the destruction of Carthage. It was the only Carthaginian literary work that the Romans deliberately preserved. Mago's treatise covered everything from viticulture and olive cultivation to animal husbandry and estate management. The agricultural hinterland of Carthage, the fertile plains of northern Tunisia, was intensively farmed using techniques that maximized yields. Irrigation systems, crop rotation, and scientific approaches to soil management made Carthaginian territory among the most productive agricultural land in the Mediterranean world. The religion of Carthage was rooted in the Phoenician traditions brought from the East, though it developed distinctly over the centuries. The chief deities were Baal-Hamon, a sky and fertility god, and Tanit, a mother goddess who became the patron deity of the city. Temples to these gods dominated the skyline of Carthage, and their worship involved elaborate rituals conducted by a powerful priesthood. The most controversial aspect of Carthaginian religion, one that has generated heated scholarly debate for over a century, is the question of child sacrifice. Ancient Greek and Roman writers consistently reported that the Carthaginians sacrificed infants to their gods, burning them alive in a precinct called the Tophet. Modern archaeologists have indeed found Tophets in Carthage and other Phoenician colonies, containing thousands of urns with the cremated remains of very young children. Whether these represent sacrifice or simply a sacred burial ground for children who died of natural causes remains intensely debated. The archaeological evidence is ambiguous, and the testimony of hostile foreign writers must always be treated with caution. But the sheer number of infant remains, and the dedication inscriptions found alongside them, suggests that some form of ritualized child death did occur, at least in certain periods. The Carthaginians spoke a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and Aramaic. They wrote using the Phoenician alphabet, the same writing system that would eventually give rise, through Greek and Latin intermediaries, to the alphabet used to write English today. Tragically, almost no Carthaginian literature has survived. The Romans destroyed the city's libraries along with everything else, and only fragments quoted by Greek and Roman authors give us any glimpse of what Carthaginian writers produced. This loss represents one of the great cultural tragedies of the ancient world. An entire civilization's intellectual output, its histories, its poetry, its philosophical and scientific works, was erased from existence. For centuries, Carthage's primary rivals in the Western Mediterranean were the Greek colonies, particularly Syracuse in Sicily. The island of Sicily, lying directly between the Italian peninsula and the North African coast, was the natural flashpoint for conflict between the two civilizations. The Greeks controlled the eastern part of the island, the Carthaginians the western part, and for over 200 years they fought intermittent wars for dominance. These conflicts produced dramatic battles, shifts of fortune, and legendary figures on both sides. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar led a massive invasion of eastern Sicily in 480 BC, only to be decisively defeated at the Battle of Himera on the same day. Tradition claimed that the Greeks defeated the Persian fleet at Salamis. The synchronicity was probably invented, but it reflected a genuine Greek perception that both battles represented civilization's triumph over barbarism. The struggle for Sicily continued through the 4th century BC. In 310 BC, the Syracusan tyrant Agathocles launched an audacious invasion of Carthaginian North Africa itself, the first time a European army had carried war to Carthaginian soil. Though ultimately unsuccessful, Agathocles' expedition demonstrated that Carthage was not invulnerable. A generation later, King Pyrrhus of Epirus intervened in Sicily on behalf of the Greeks and nearly drove the Carthaginians off the island entirely before his own political missteps forced him to withdraw. But all of these conflicts were mere preludes to the great confrontation that would determine the fate of the Western world. The wars between Carthage and Rome. Rome and Carthage had long been aware of each other, and for centuries their relationship was generally cooperative. They signed their first treaty in 509 BC, the same year that Rome, according to tradition, expelled its last king and established the Republic. This early treaty acknowledged Carthaginian dominance at sea and Roman dominance in Italy, and established rules for trade between the two powers. Further treaties followed in 348 and 306 BC, each reflecting the growing power of both states and the need to delineate their respective spheres of influence. As late as 280 BC, when Pyrrhus invaded Italy, Carthage and Rome were allies against a common enemy, with the Carthaginian fleet providing support to the Roman war effort. But by the mid-3rd century BC, Rome had completed its conquest of the Italian peninsula and was looking beyond its borders. Carthage still controlled western Sicily, and the narrow Strait of Messina that separated Sicily from Italy was barely 3 kilometers wide. Two great powers, expanding toward each other across a shrinking buffer zone, with incompatible interests in the same strategically vital island. Conflict was perhaps inevitable. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over a relatively minor dispute involving a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana. But it quickly escalated into a titanic struggle that lasted 23 years, the longest continuous war in ancient history up to that point. The core problem for both sides was that Carthage dominated the sea while Rome dominated the land. To fight effectively in Sicily, Rome needed a navy. And so, beginning from virtually nothing, the Romans built one. The Roman achievement in naval construction during the First Punic War was extraordinary. According to the historian Polybius, the Romans used a captured Carthaginian warship as a model and built an entire fleet of 120 vessels in just 60 days. The ships were quinqueremes, large warships propelled by 5 banks of oars and carrying crews of around 300 men each. The Romans, inexperienced at sea, compensated by inventing a boarding device called the corvus, a heavy plank with a spike at its end that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, locking the two vessels together and allowing Roman soldiers to cross and fight as they would on land. The corvus negated much of Carthage's advantage in seamanship and naval maneuver. The war saw enormous losses on both sides. Rome lost over 600 ships during the conflict, many to storms rather than enemy action, along with perhaps 100,000 sailors and marines. Carthage lost hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of men. The fighting ranged across Sicily, North Africa, Sardinia, and the open sea. In 256 BC, Rome launched an invasion of Africa under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, who won an initial victory and demanded humiliating peace terms. But the Carthaginians rallied, hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus, and destroyed the Roman army, capturing Regulus himself. The subsequent Roman fleet sent to evacuate survivors was wrecked by a storm, losing nearly 100,000 men in what may be the greatest maritime disaster in history. Yet Rome refused to accept defeat. This was perhaps the single most important factor in the eventual outcome. Rome could absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting because it drew upon the manpower of all Italy, while Carthage relied heavily on mercenary armies that were expensive to recruit and maintain. After 23 years of grinding attrition, Carthage sued for peace in 241 BC. The terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered Sicily entirely, paid an enormous indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, and agreed not to attack Rome's allies. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The aftermath of the First Punic War was catastrophic for Carthage. The mercenary armies that had fought for Carthage in Sicily returned home and demanded their back pay. When the Carthaginian government, its treasury depleted by war and indemnity, could not pay in full, the mercenaries revolted. The resulting conflict, known as the Truceless War or the Mercenary War, lasted from 241 to 237 BC and nearly destroyed Carthage from within. The violence was extreme on both sides, with atrocities that shocked even ancient observers accustomed to the brutalities of war. It was during this crisis that a young general named Hamilcar Barca emerged as Carthage's savior, defeating the mercenary armies through a combination of brilliant tactics and ruthless determination. Hamilcar Barca is one of the most significant figures in Carthaginian history, though he is often overshadowed by his more famous son. After saving Carthage from the mercenary revolt, Hamilcar conceived a bold strategy to rebuild Carthaginian power. If Carthage had lost its position in Sicily, Sardinia, and the islands, it would build a new empire in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was rich in silver, tin, copper, and iron. Its population could provide recruits for a new army. And from Spain, a land route existed that could one day carry a Carthaginian army overland to Italy itself, bypassing Roman naval superiority entirely. In 237 BC, Hamilcar crossed to Spain with his army and his 9-year-old son Hannibal. Before departing, according to the ancient sources, he made the boy swear an oath of eternal enmity against Rome. Whether or not this specific story is true, it captures the animating passion of the Barca family. They had not accepted the verdict of the First Punic War. They intended to fight again. Over the next 2 decades, the Barca family transformed southern Spain into a Carthaginian domain. Hamilcar conquered tribe after tribe, extracting tribute and recruiting soldiers. He founded the city of Acre-Luke as a regional capital. When he died in battle in 229 BC, command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, who continued the expansion and founded the city of Carthago Nova, New Carthage, modern Cartagena, which became the Carthaginian capital in Spain. Its silver mines alone reportedly produced 300 pounds of silver per day. The wealth flowing from Spain replenished the Carthaginian treasury, paid off the Roman war indemnity, and funded the recruitment of a formidable new army. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army acclaimed 25-year-old Hannibal Barca as their commander. He had spent his entire life in military camps, trained by some of the finest soldiers in the Mediterranean world. He spoke multiple languages, studied Greek military theory, and possessed an intuitive understanding of terrain, timing, and the psychology of his opponents that bordered on genius. Within 2 years, he would launch one of the most audacious military campaigns in all of human history. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC when Hannibal besieged and captured Saguntum, a Spanish city allied with Rome. But Hannibal had no intention of waiting for Rome to bring the war to him. His plan was breathtaking in its boldness. He would march his army overland from Spain, across southern Gaul, over the Alps, and into Italy itself. He would fight Rome on its own soil, hoping to break the network of alliances that gave Rome its overwhelming manpower advantage. If he could convince Rome's Italian allies to defect, Rome would be reduced to a single city-state, unable to sustain a prolonged war. Hannibal left Carthago Nova in the spring of 218 BC with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. By the time he reached the Alps, after fighting his way through hostile Gallic tribes and crossing the wide Rhone River with his elephants on specially constructed rafts, his force had been reduced to around 50,000 men. The Alpine crossing itself, conducted in late autumn when early snows already covered the passes, cost him nearly half of his remaining army. Rock falls, hostile mountain tribes, exhaustion, and cold killed thousands. Many of the elephants perished. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy in November of 218 BC, he had barely 26,000 men left, a fraction of the force he had started with. But those 26,000 were hardened veterans, and their commander was perhaps the greatest tactical general the ancient world ever produced. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sequences of victories in military history. In December 218 BC, Hannibal defeated a Roman army at the river Trebia, using a concealed force under his brother Mago to strike the Roman rear at the decisive moment. In June 217 BC, he destroyed an entire Roman army at Lake Trasimene, springing an ambush from the fog-shrouded hills above the lake's narrow shore. The consul Gaius Flaminius was killed along with 15,000 of his men. It was the largest ambush in terms of numbers involved that the ancient world had ever seen. But the greatest blow was yet to come. On August 2, 216 BC, near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, Hannibal faced the largest Roman army ever assembled, approximately 86,000 men under the command of the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The Romans had adopted a simple strategy: overwhelm the Carthaginians with sheer weight of numbers, packing their infantry so densely that nothing could resist their advance. Hannibal, outnumbered nearly 2-1, devised a response that military theorists still study today. He arranged his army in a convex formation, with his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, at the center, and his best African infantry on the flanks. As the massive Roman force pushed forward, the Carthaginian center deliberately gave ground, bending backward like a bow being drawn. The Romans, sensing victory, pressed harder, crowding more and more men into the shrinking space at the center. They did not notice that the Carthaginian flanks were holding firm, and that Hannibal's superior cavalry had swept the Roman horsemen from the field. When the center had bent far enough, the African infantry on both flanks turned inward, and the victorious cavalry struck the Roman rear. The Romans were completely surrounded. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. Packed so tightly they could barely raise their weapons, the Roman soldiers were cut down over the course of several hours. Ancient sources record that between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans were killed at Cannae, including the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and numerous other men of high rank. It was the worst single-day military defeat in Roman history, and one of the bloodiest battles ever fought in the ancient world. In terms of casualties inflicted in a single engagement, Cannae was not surpassed until the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, over 2,000 years later. After Cannae, much of southern Italy defected to Hannibal, exactly as he had hoped. The great city of Capua, the second largest in Italy, opened its gates to him. So did many communities in Samnium, Lucania, and Bruttium. Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily, abandoned its Roman alliance. King Philip V of Macedon signed a treaty with Hannibal, threatening Rome with war on a second front. For a brief moment in 216 BC, it seemed entirely possible that Rome would be destroyed. But Rome did not fall. And the reasons it survived reveal something fundamental about the Roman character. After Cannae, the Senate refused to negotiate. They refused to ransom the thousands of Roman prisoners Hannibal held. They refused to consider peace on any terms. Instead, they recruited new legions from among Rome's remaining allies, arming even slaves and criminals. they appointed the cautious Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man whose strategy of avoiding pitched battle and harassing Hannibal's supply lines earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. It was not a glamorous strategy. It was deeply unpopular with the Roman public. But it worked. Hannibal remained in Italy for 16 years, from 218 to 203 BC. He won every major engagement he fought. But he could never force a decisive conclusion. He lacked siege equipment to assault Rome's fortified cities. He received almost no reinforcements from Carthage, whose senate was divided between supporters and opponents of the Bassa family. And slowly, relentlessly, the Romans ground down his allies, recapturing cities one by one, punishing those who had defected with terrible severity. Capua was retaken in 211 BC, and its leading citizens were executed. Syracuse fell in the same year, despite the defensive genius of the mathematician Archimedes, who designed war machines that held the Romans at bay for 2 years. Meanwhile, Rome opened a second front in Spain, eventually sending the young general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, to command there. Scipio was brilliant, charismatic, and had carefully studied Hannibal's tactics. Between 210 and 206 BC, he systematically conquered Carthaginian Spain, capturing Carthago Nova in a daring assault, defeating Carthaginian armies in open battle, and cutting off the flow of silver and recruits that sustained Hannibal's war effort. When Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal attempted to march a relief army from Spain to Italy in 207 BC, retracing Hannibal's Alpine route, a Roman army intercepted and destroyed him at the Battle of the Metaurus. Hasdrubal's head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. It was the moment Hannibal knew the war in Italy was lost. In 204 BC, Scipio carried the war to Africa, landing an army near Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy, ending his 16-year campaign without ever having been defeated in battle on Italian soil. The two greatest generals of their age met at the Battle of Zama in October 202 BC. This time, Hannibal was outmatched. Scipio had learned from the master and turned his own tactics against him. The Carthaginian army was destroyed, and Hannibal himself barely escaped with his life. The peace terms that followed were devastating. Carthage surrendered its entire fleet except 10 ships. It gave up all territory outside Africa. It paid an indemnity of 10,000 talents, to be paid over 50 years. And crucially, it agreed never to wage war without Roman permission. Carthage survived, but as a shadow of its former self, a commercial city stripped of military power, existing at Rome's sufferance. Hannibal remained in Carthage after the war, serving as Saphete and reforming the city's finances with the same brilliance he had shown on the battlefield. He rooted out corruption, streamlined tax collection, and demonstrated that Carthage could pay its enormous indemnity without impoverishing its citizens. But his continued presence made Rome nervous. In 195 BC, under Roman pressure, Hannibal went into exile. He spent the remaining years of his life advising various Eastern kings against Rome, always hoping to find a power willing and able to challenge Roman dominance. He never did. In 183 BC, cornered by Roman agents at the court of King Prusias of Bithynia, Hannibal took poison rather than be captured. He was 64 years old. His last words, according to tradition, were, "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who thought it too lengthy and too heavy a task to wait for the death of a hated old man." Carthage itself experienced a remarkable economic recovery in the decades after Zama. Stripped of its empire and its military, the city threw all its energy into commerce and agriculture. By the 150s BC, it had paid off the entire war indemnity ahead of schedule and was once again one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean. This prosperity, paradoxically, sealed its doom. A faction in the Roman Senate, led by the elder Cato, viewed Carthage's resurgence with alarm. Cato reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic being discussed, with the words "Carthago delenda estimated Carthage must be destroyed." The Third Punic War, which lasted from 149 to 146 BC, was less a war than a calculated act of destruction. Rome manufactured a pretext for conflict, demanding that Carthage abandon its coastal location and move inland, a demand that would have destroyed its commercial livelihood and that the Romans knew would be refused. When Carthage refused, Rome sent an army. The Carthaginians, knowing that surrender meant destruction, chose to fight. Despite having no army and no weapons, having disarmed as part of the earlier peace treaty, the citizens of Carthage organized a desperate defense. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. Workshops across the city produced hundreds of weapons daily. Temples were melted down for metal. The walls, still standing from centuries past, were reinforced and manned. Against all expectations, Carthage held out for 3 years against the full might of Rome. The end came in the spring of 146 BC, when the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Hannibal's conqueror, finally breached the walls. What followed was 6 days of brutal street fighting, house by house, building by building. The Carthaginians fought with the desperation of people who knew that surrender offered no salvation. When it was over, the ancient sources record that Scipio wept as he watched the city burn, quoting Homer's lines about the fall of Troy, and reflecting that one day Rome itself might meet the same fate. The destruction of Carthage was systematic and deliberate. The city was burned. Its walls were demolished. Its population, those who survived the siege and assault, approximately 50,000 people, were sold into slavery. Ancient tradition holds that the Romans plowed the site and sowed it with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Modern historians doubt the salt story, as salt was far too expensive to waste in such quantities. But the symbolic intent is clear. Rome wanted Carthage not merely defeated but erased from existence. The territory of Carthage became the Roman province of Africa, one of the most valuable in the empire. The fertile agricultural lands that Carthaginian farmers had cultivated for centuries continued to produce abundant grain, now feeding Rome rather than Carthage. A century later, Julius Caesar established a Roman colony on the site of the destroyed city, and Carthage was eventually reborn as a major Roman metropolis, becoming the 4th largest city in the empire. But it was a Roman Carthage, built over the ashes of the Phoenician original, with Latin replacing Punic, Roman temples replacing those of Baal and Tanit, and Roman law governing where Carthaginian custom once held sway. The legacy of Carthage is a difficult one to assess, precisely because the victors controlled the narrative so completely. Almost everything we know about Carthage comes from Greek and Roman sources, most of them hostile. The Carthaginians' own literature, their histories, their philosophical works, their poetry, all were destroyed. We see Carthage almost entirely through the eyes of its enemies, filtered through centuries of propaganda and cultural bias. the Romans portrayed the Carthaginians as treacherous, cruel, and godless, coining the phrase punica fides, Punic faith, as a byword for deceit. How much of this characterization reflects reality and how much reflects Roman self-justification is impossible to determine with certainty. What we can say is that Carthage represented an alternative model of civilization to Rome's. Where Rome expanded through military conquest and direct political control, Carthage expanded primarily through trade and commercial influence. Where Rome absorbed conquered peoples into its political system, granting citizenship and demanding military service, Carthage maintained a looser network of commercial relationships and tributary alliances. Where Rome glorified the farmer soldier and viewed commerce with some suspicion, Carthage celebrated the merchant and the entrepreneur. It is tempting to speculate about how differently Mediterranean history might have developed if Carthage rather than Rome had emerged victorious from their great struggle. But such speculation is ultimately fruitless. History does not deal in hypotheticals. What is certain is that the Punic Wars, the three conflicts between Rome and Carthage spanning over a century from 264 to 146 BC, transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. The challenge of fighting Carthage forced Rome to develop a navy, to project power overseas, to govern foreign territories, and to sustain military efforts on a scale previously unimaginable. In many ways, it was the struggle against Carthage that created the Roman Empire. Without the Punic Wars, Rome might have remained an Italian power, significant but limited in scope. The existential threat posed by Hannibal, the closest any enemy ever came to destroying Rome, forged the Roman character in ways that shaped the next 5 centuries of Mediterranean history. Hannibal himself became a figure of almost mythical stature in the Roman imagination. Centuries after his death, Roman generals still measured themselves against him. Roman mothers frightened naughty children with the warning Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates. His tactical innovations, particularly the double envelopment at Cannae, became standard study material for military commanders throughout history. Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and countless other generals cited Hannibal as their inspiration. The United States Army still teaches Cannae at West Point as the archetypal battle of annihilation. And Carthage itself, though destroyed in body, was never entirely forgotten. Its ghost haunted the Roman imagination for centuries. When Rome finally fell to barbarian invaders in the 5th century AD, more than one ancient writer recalled Scipio's tears and his prophecy that Rome would one day share Carthage's fate. The symmetry was too perfect to resist. Two great civilizations, each destroyed at the height of their power, each leaving behind ruins that testified to the impermanence of all human achievement. Today, the archaeological site of Carthage lies within the suburbs of modern Tunis. Scattered ruins of the Roman city are visible, along with fragments of the Punic original that survived beneath the later construction. The Tophet, the sacred precinct where urns of infant remains were buried, has been excavated and studied. The outlines of the great circular military harbor can still be traced. But the living city, the bustling port where Phoenician merchants counted their silver and Punic sailors set out for unknown shores, exists now only in fragments of text and scattered archaeological finds. It is a reminder that even the greatest civilizations are mortal, that wealth and power and walls offer no permanent protection against the passage of time and the ambitions of rivals. The story of Carthage and Rome is ultimately a story about the contingency of history. There was nothing inevitable about Rome's victory. At multiple points, Hannibal came within reach of destroying the Roman state. A different decision here, a stroke of luck there, and the entire subsequent history of Western civilization might have unfolded along radically different lines. Latin might never have become the dominant language of Western Europe. Roman law might never have formed the foundation of modern legal systems. The cultural synthesis of Greek thought and Roman power that shaped medieval and modern Europe might never have occurred. The world we inhabit is, in part, the product of battles fought and decisions made during the struggle between these two great cities over 2,000 years ago. And so Carthage endures in memory, if not in stone. It endures as a testament to what a maritime trading civilization could achieve. It endures in the person of Hannibal, whose military genius has never been surpassed. It endures in the questions it raises about power, about the justice of victors, about the fragility of even the most prosperous societies. And it endures as a reminder that history is written by those who survive, and that behind every triumphant narrative there lies a silenced voice, a burned library, a story that will never be told in its own words. The Carthaginians had a word for their city. They called it Carthage, the new city. But time has made it ancient beyond measure, and its silence speaks as loudly as any words.